California government. What is the term of office, in years, for the California Assembly and Senate? What is the maximum number of terms that members may serve in each chamber? Cali Assembly, 2-year terms, 12-term max. Cali Senate, 4-year terms, 2-term max. Who is the presiding officer of the CA Assembly and Senate? Presiding officer of Assembly, the Speaker. Presiding officer of Senate, LT Governor. What are the major powers of the CA Assembly Speaker? What are the major powers of the President pro tem of the CA Senate? Powers of CA Assembly Speaker, can appoint committee chairs, most members of Rules Committee, and standing committee members. Powers of President pro tem, Rules Committee appointments, appoints chairs and members to committees. How do legislative procedures of the California Senate differ from those of the U.S. Senate? CA has greater ethnic diversity, 38%. Higher median household income, $61,000. Contains more college graduates, 26.6%. California Senate has a system of initiatives and referendums that allow the citizen to have a say by having the ability to propose laws and changes to the California Constitution. Also on the other half, with the referendums allowing legislators to refer proposed laws or amendment to voters for approval. Keeps a good policy check on everything in the aspect of office activity. As opposed to the U.S. Senate, where we rely on officials to make proposals and let them vote on what type of legislative laws gets put on the ballots for votes. While the whole time, they still have the final say on whether to imply and interpret the new law and proposition because they make the final vote. Does this answer the question? I think that it is asking about procedures such as initiative, referendum etc. which only apply to state gov rather than fed gov. Most legislation in the California legislature requires what portion of each chamber to pass, e.g., simple majority, 3/5 THS majority, 2/3 RDS majority, etc. Simple majority 3/5. I think this is just simple majority, not 3/5. What proportion of the California legislature is required to raise taxes? Majority vote, 2/3 RDS. What is the term of office, in years, for the elected members of the California executive branch and what is the maximum number of terms that each may serve? 4-year term, 2 terms maximum, 8 years total. What is the difference between a unitary and plural executive? Which does California have? Plural. Each expensive office is elected independently of the others and is not directly responsible to others, 4 YRS, 2 terms max. California has a plural executive branch. Presidency equals Unitarian executive. Explain the major powers and responsibilities of each the following executive offices. Governor controls budgets, appoint officers, approves or denies laws tried to put forth, Commander-in-Chief of CA National Guard, Chief Executor of the laws, in charge of 11 departments, Corrections, Education, Environment, HHS, Finance, Agriculture, Business/Transport, Labor, proposes budget and laws. Lieutenant Governor, Head of State Senate, votes only if there's a tie, succeeds Governor, acts as Governor when actual Governor is out of state, sits on various boards. Attorney General, Chief Legal Officer, in charge of State Department of Justice, oversees prosecutors, lawyers, and sheriffs, current in Xavier Becerra, D. Secretary of State, Chief Elections Officer, organizes elections, voter registration, sample ballots, voter guides, etc. Controller, Chief Financial Officer/Auditor, Chief Tax Collector, oversees disbursement of funds, audits state financial accounts, more power than Treasurer. Treasurer, minor financial official, finances bonds, administrations, states pension funds. Explain the similarities and differences between the executive officers of CA and their U.S. federal government counterparts. Explain the advantages and disadvantages of the way that the executive offices of CA are structured. Differences. ADV, stimulates public politics interest because able to have direct involvement, allows citizens to check in legislature in gov office, decreases in special interest. Dis, promotes majority tyranny, others get pushed out, decrease in voter initiative, fail to see long-term effects, interests groups dominate. Initiative versus referendum. Initiative, citizens propose laws or changes to CA Constitution to voters for approval. Statute laws, petitions, 5% of voters, single subject. Constitutional amendment, petitions, 8% of voters, single subject. Simple majority to pass, if two or more conflicting propositions pass, the one with most votes prevail. Judicial scrutiny, legislative may not pass a law. Referendum, legislators refer proposed laws or amendment to voters for approval. Compulsory, required, mostly government bonds, 2/3 must proposed, multiple subject, simple majority. Petitions, prevent law passed by legislative from becoming a law, within 90 days, 5% of voters, simple majority. Why initiative, public interest in politics/policy, check on legislature and governor, check on special interests. Criticisms of initiative, majority tyranny, voter ignorance, voters fail to see long-term/wider impact, voter-swayed political ads, interest groups DOM process, poorly drafted. What is the term of office, in years, for the members of the California judiciary? Who determines whether judges get to remain in office for another term? Max 12 years. The voters decide whether judges get to remain in office. How do the features of the CA state judiciary compare/contrast to the federal judiciary? Explain the advantages and disadvantages of the way that the CA judiciary is structured. CA, subject to voter approval, ruling of the court have to comply with what SC rules to the extent that it involves a federal issue, more like a direct democracy or representative democracy in compared to federal government, plural executive, term limits for legislative and executive branches, referendums and initiatives, recalls, no term limits. Fed Judiciary, SC, appointed by President and confirmed by Senate, justices have life terms and they can be renewed by the vote in by the people, there for life. ADV, stimulates public's interest in policy and politics, allows citizens to put a check on legislature and governor's office, people are deciding, decreases influence of special interests, recall, allows another check on public officials. Dis-ADV, promote majority tyranny, voter influence, voters fail to see the long term, swayed by political ads more, voter ignorance, interest groups dominate process. Explain the difference between what appellate courts do and what trial courts do. Trial courts where the case begins, has witness testimony and arguing evidence. Appellate courts, appeal ruling from trial court. Jury, only things argued are points of law, only legal procedure, not collecting more evidence. What is an initiative? What proportion of votes does it take for a regular initiative to pass? What proportion of votes does it take for an initiative constitutional amendment to pass? Citizens directly propose a law or change to the CA Constitution to the voters for approval, thus bypassing the normal legislative process. Simple majority to pass. 5%. -8% of voters. What are the arguments in favor and the arguments against the initiative process? In favor, stimulates public interest in policy/politics. Check on legislature and governor. Check on special interests. Against, majority tyranny. Voter ignorance. Voters fail to see long-term/wider impacts. Voters swayed by political ads. Interest groups dominate the process. Poorly drafted. What is a referendum? What proportion of votes does it take for a referendum to pass? Legislators reflect a proposed law or amendment to the CA Constitution to voters for approval, compulsory and petition. -5%. Overturn tax interest. Only after CA legislature has passed a law, a reactive mechanism passed law. What is a recall? What proportion of votes is required to recall an elected official? What proportion of votes is required for a replacement candidate to win a recall election? Recall equals allows voters to remove a public official before the end of the official's terms of office. Differs from impeachment. Petition with 12% or 20% voters. Simple majority to recall, plurality to replace current office holders if majority approves recall. CA government can recall elected officials before their term ends. What is the difference between a partisan and non-partisan election? Partisan is one where candidates are listed on the ballot with indication of their political party. Non-partisan is one where candidates are listed on the ballot without indication of their political party. How strong are political parties in CA? How strong are interest groups in CA? Cal political parties weak because of progressive era reforms, direct primaries and nonpartisan elections. CA primary system, top 2 regardless of part. As a consequence of weak parties, interest groups are relatively strong. What has been responsible for the limited taxing and spending power of the CA state government? Constitutional balanced budget requirement. Proposition 13, 1978. Caps property tax rates to 1% of assessed value. Limits property taxes increases to 2% year after purchase. Requires 2/3 RDS of legislature to increase state taxes, 2/3 RDS vote approval of new local special taxes. Legislature sends prop tax revenue to localities. Proposition 98. -40% of general fund must go to public school education, K-12 and community colleges. Result of various propositions, 2/3 RDS of budget beyond legislative control. Voters, the people. What are the major items of expense in the CA budget? K-12 education 41.8%. Healthcare 20.6%. Higher education, colleges, 11.9%. Prisons 8.7%. Welfare 6.9%. Miscellaneous 10.1%. In what ways does the CA electorate differ from the rest of the country? How are county governments structured in California? What are the main functions of county government? Governing body, Board of Supervisors, usually 5 members elected in districts nonpartisan, 4-year term. Other officials, sheriff, district attorney, assessor. Powers, legislative, orders, ordinances, taxes, and executive, oversees but does not direct day-to-day operation of department county administrator. Functions, public protection, public assistance, health and sanitation, public works, and recreation. How are city governments structured in California? What are the main functions of city government? Governing body, city council, usually 5 members elected at large nonpartisan, 4-year terms, part-time office. At large versus small member districts. At large districts equals less divisive, promotes moderation. Broader range of candidates. Small member districts equals more attention to local concerns. Reps look more like their voters. Easier to campaign. Executive, council manager model versus strong mayor council model. Powers, legislative, ordinances, zoning, taxes, and executive, oversees but does not direct day-to-day operations of deputy city manager or mayor. Functions, public safety, police and fire, public utilities, water, electric, etc., public works, health and sanitation, and recreation. As compared to the federal government, CA government is characterized as being more like a direct democracy or representative democracy. What features of CA government would you cite to substantiate your answer? Initiatives and referendums. Plural executive. Term limits for legislative and executive branch. Judiciary does not have life term and elected by the people. Recalls. Public Policy Chapter 16 to 17. What is public policy? Series of collective decisions that are made by individuals in order to accomplish a particular aim. The policy represents collection of decisions made by these people. Not a law. What are and what happens in each of the major stages of the public policy process? Agenda setting. Condition to issue. Triggering mechanisms, crisis, technological change, policy entrepreneurs, interest groups. Defining the problem. What is the problem precisely? What are the sources of the problem? Formulate policy and build support. Reaching formal agenda. Considerations, path dependence, veto points, iron triangle, incrementalism. Implementation. Vague laws. Congress provides vague guidelines, executives must figure out what the law requires. Complexity, coordination, communication between bureaucratic agencies. Evaluation. Policy analysis. Unintended consequences of putting public policy into place. Keep, modify, or terminate. Terminate, rare. Keep, modify. What do the following public policy evaluation criteria mean? Implementation, unintended consequences, inconsistency. Implementation, process of carrying out public policy through governmental agencies and the courts, can also be done via lawsuits, administrative agencies, and voluntary compliance. Unintended consequences are outcomes that are not the ones foreseen and intended by an action that was taken to solve a prior, different problem. He explained this in class, but I don't have exactly what he said. Inconsistency, not staying the same throughout, again don't know exactly. Explain each of the following types of coalitions: majoritarian politics, entrepreneurial politics, client politics, and interest group politics. Can SOME1 go more in depth? W/these if needed. I'm pulling from Quizlet. Majoritarian, a policy in which almost everybody benefits and almost everybody pays. Entrepreneurial, a policy in which almost everybody benefits and a small group pays the cost. Costs are concentrated. People who organize pay the hardships. Client, a policy in which one small group benefits and almost everybody pays. Interest group, a policy in which one small group benefits and another small group pays. What's the difference between fiscal, monetary, regulatory, and social welfare policy? Can SOME1 go more in depth? W/these if needed. I'm pulling from Quizlet. Fiscal, a tool of economic management by which government can attempt to maintain a stable economy through its taxing and spending policies. Monetary, form of government regulation in which the nation's money supply and interest rates are controlled. Regulatory, government policies that limit what businesses can do. Examples include minimum wages, workplace safety measures, and careful monitoring of stock sales. Social welfare, policies that provide benefits, cash or in kind, to individuals, based on their entitlement or means testing. What is a deficit? How does it differ from debt? The deficit is a measure of a single year's shortfall, the difference between what the government takes in and what it spends. And in recent years, the deficit has been declining, thanks to the end of the recession and lower government spending. Budget deficit, from textbook, economic condition that occurs when expenditures exceed revenue. Deficit equals 1 year. Debt equals all money owed. What's the difference between discretionary and mandatory spending? Give examples of each. Roughly what proportion of spending by the federal government is mandatory? Mandatory spending is also known as entitlement spending and goes to programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Don't vote on how much money is allowed to be spent, there is a formula. X. Social Security. Discretionary spending must be approved by the Congress every year in the appropriations process and, unlike most mandatory spending, is subject to a predetermined limit each year. 8. X. National defense. Roughly 30% is discretionary, so roughly 70% is mandatory. What are entitlements? Give examples. Basically, a form of mandatory spending. X. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. From the textbook. Many income security programs are entitlement programs, government benefits that all citizens meeting eligibility criteria such as age, income level, or unemployment are legally entitled to receive. Unlike programs such as public housing, military construction, and space exploration, spending for entitlement programs is mandatory and places a substantial ongoing financial burden on the national and state governments. Means tested v. non-means tested programs. Non-means tested don't take into account your income and savings in the same way, but they do have rules which must be met. Means tested, amount of income and capital you have can affect your eligibility. What proportion of the federal budget is currently devoted to defense spending, Entitlements. Largest is entitlements, then defense spending. Remember, most of the budget goes to the poor and old. What has been the trend since 1965 of each shares portion of the federal budget? 1. Old people, entitlement programs. 2. Defense. Entitlements budget keeps getting a bigger and bigger share at the expense of everything else. Social Security and Medicare has increased, baby boomers. Civil liberties. Explain the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties, freedom from interference by gov, or individuals, in the exercise of rights, liberty. Civil liberties are personal guarantees and freedoms that the government cannot abridge by law, constitution, or judicial interpretation. In other words, government cannot restrain or dictate actions. Civil rights provide freedom from arbitrary or discriminatory treatment by government or individuals. What are the protections afforded in each amendment in the Bill of Rights? First Amendment: freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. Establishment Clause directs national government not to sanction an official religion. Free Exercise Clause prohibits the U.S. government from interfering with citizens' right to practice his/her religion. Protected speech equals limiting prior restraint, symbolic speech, and hate speech. Second Amendment: right to keep and bear arms. Asterisk first added to appease anti-federalists so that Congress could not pass laws to disarm state militias. 1939 U.S. v. Miller Court ruled that amend was only intended to protect a citizen's right to own ordinary militia weapons. 2000's right for individual personal use of firearm. Third Amendment: no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house, without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the federal government without probable cause. Also puts into detail what may or may not be searched unless a warrant is issued. Without a warrant, police may search 1. the person arrested, 2. things in plain view of the accused person, 3. places or things that the arrested person could touch or reach or that are otherwise in the arrestee's immediate control. In a place where no arrest occurs and individuals have some expectation of privacy, house offices, police must obtain search warrants prior to conducting more extensive searches. Warrantless searches may also occur if police suspect that someone is committing a crime. Through reasonable suspicion, a police officer may stop and frisk. Warrantless searches are permissible in places where citizens cannot reasonably expect privacy. Field warrant not necessary if everyone consents. Fifth Amendment provides a variety of guarantees protecting those charged with a crime. Provides for indictment by a grand jury and protection against self-incrimination, includes any statements/or confessions that someone did not make voluntarily/was forced, and prevents the national government from denying a person life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Also prevents the national government from taking away property without just compensation. Miranda v. Arizona, 1966, requires individuals arrested for a crime to be advised of their rights to remain silent and to have counsel present. Sixth Amendment, right to a speedy and public trial. Seventh Amendment, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined. Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Ninth Amendment, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. What is the doctrine of selective incorporation? Judicial doctrine whereby most, but not all, protections found in the Bill of Rights are made applicable to the states via the 14th Amendment. Limits the rights of states so that they cannot impede fundamental freedoms. Explain what are the arguments made in support of the separation of church and state. 1. Government is imposing will of God on population, there is no obvious set of rulers, impossible to see and know for certain who represents God. 2. Can't force beliefs onto people. They won't be genuine believers. Government can force them to lie, but then they become hypocrites. Who speaks for God, and you cannot oppose the will of God? No one has obvious belief. No genuine believer cannot force people to believe. Will make them hypocrites. What are the two opposing views of how to interpret the establishment clause of the First Amendment? Separationists, thick wall between church and state. Combinationists, as long as government isn't trying to force one religion, there should be some government accommodation. What is the Lemon Test? Three-part test created by the Supreme Court for examining the constitutionality of religious establishment issues. 1. Had a legitimate or secular purpose. 2. Neither advanced nor inhibited religion. 3. Did not foster an excessive government entanglement with religion. What is the secular regulation rule? Legislation is invalid if it does not serve legitimate rule denying any constitutional right to exemption on free exercise grounds from laws dealing with non-religious matters. What are the major limitations and exceptions to freedom of speech and press? Limitations equals freedom of speech and freedom of press. Government not coming in BC, it violates freedom of speech. Exceptions equals slander, writing, and libel, speech, obscenity and symbolic speech, slander, writing of Bibles in speech, obscenity, public speech, presenting clear and present danger. What is prior restraint? Gov censorship of info before it is published or broadcast on information that can be seen as harmful or libel. Define libel, obscenity, symbolic speech. Libel, a written defamation of a person's character, reputation, business, or property rights, writing that falsely injures another person. Obscenity, defined in Miller v. California as arousing/unwholesome in nature with no artistic, scientific, literary, or political value. Symbolic speech, an act that conveys a political message. What is major point of disagreement on how to interpret the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment? Which is the prevailing view under Supreme Court precedent? The major point of disagreement is whether or not the Second Amendment is an individual right or a collective right. The collective right argument is centered on the first part of the amendment's text of a well-regulated militia, being the necessary to the security of a free state, and thus can only be interpreted as the collective right to form a militia when necessary or prompted, not as the individual right to own guns. This would allow the government to place stricter regulations on individual gun ownership. The individual right argument focuses on the second part of the text, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. This is the viewpoint that was determined as constitutional by the Supreme Court in D.C. v. Heller, 2008. This has allowed courts to strike down gun control legislation. What is eminent domain? According to the Fifth Amendment, what is required for the government to exercise eminent domain? What is the current definition of public use as established in the case of Kelo v. City of New London, 2005? Eminent domain allows the government the right to take property with just compensation and for public use. Just compensation only has to be compensating the property owner with the fair market value of their property, so they can essentially pay you an amount you would never sell your house for. The current definition of public use is that public officials are the ones who determine what is considered public purpose. This gives a broader definition than the contrasting view that the new structure must be used by the public. Parking lots, for example, are built for public purpose whether or not they are actually used by the public. What is the Miranda warning and under what circumstances must it be given? 2 conditions that trigger Miranda rights. You must be in custody or under arrest. You must also be interrogated by police officer or prosecutor or public official asking you questions. Everything you say can and will be used against you. What is the exclusionary rule? Bars use of illegally seized evidence at trial. Judiciary created to deter constitutional violations. Adopted by Supreme Court in Week v. U.S. What is the good faith exception rule? Exception to exclusionary rule, holding that evidence seized on the basis of a mistakenly issued search warrant can be introduced if the mistake was made in good faith, of all the parties involved had reason at the time to believe that the warrant was proper. Explain, writ of habeas corpus, Bill of Attainder, ex post facto law. Habeas corpus. Produce the body. Done by the attorney that says you must produce the body that you are being held in prison and that will force the gov to press formal charges. Congress has the right to disband the right of habeas corpus during the times of war or public safety. Done during the Civil War. Bill of Attainder. Legislative enactment that convicts an individual or group of individuals for a crime without a jury trial. You are guilty until proven innocence. Something that is precluded by a right to a jury trial. Ex post facto law. Law that makes an act punishable as a crime even if the action was legal at the time it was committed. What are the due process rights afforded to criminal defendants under Amendments 5 to 6, 8? X. Right against self-incrimination, double jeopardy, right to an attorney, no cruel and unusual punishment, etc. Amendment 5. No person shall be held to answer for a capital, or otherwise infamous crime, unless on an indictment of a grand jury, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law. Amendment 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial, by an impartial jury, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Amendment 8. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Where in the Constitution is the right to privacy mentioned? Which landmark Supreme Court case established the right to privacy? How did the court further expand privacy in subsequent cases? Not mentioned in a specific place. Landmark SC case Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965 SC ruled that various guarantees in law have Griswold zones of privacy. Right to privacy was upheld, also stated that the use of contraceptives is an intimate act and that government has no right regulating it. Roe v. Wade, 1973 extended right to privacy as SC ruled that government has no right to regulate abortions in women's first trimester. Lawrence v. Texas, 2003 SC ruled that certain state laws violate right to privacy. Civil rights. What was the Dred Scott v. Sandford case about? Case, slave brought into northern state. If slave owner brought slave into northern state voluntarily, he was free. Slave sued for freedom. Supreme Court ruled that blacks could never become citizens of the U.S., therefore they could never sue in court. They will always be regarded as people without civil rights. Property must be protected everywhere in the Union. Implied that slaves can be brought into the northern states. Nullified the Missouri Compromise. What specifically is contained in the 13-15th amendments? 13th, no involuntary servitude, no slavery. 14th, no state shall deprive any person of equal protection of the laws. 15th, voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition. But not women. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, established which doctrine? Separate but equal. What were Jim Crow laws? During the years of Jim Crow, state laws mandated racial separation in schools, parks, playgrounds, restaurants, hotels, public transport. What specific restrictions did racial minorities face in exercising their right to vote? Poll taxes. Literacy tests. Whites-only primaries. Grandfather clause. Determined eligibility to vote depending on your ancestor. If grandfather had the right to vote, the day before the Civil War began, then you can vote. If not, you can't either. What did the Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, do? The Supreme Court overruled Plessy v. Ferguson, declared that racially segregated facilities are inherently unequal and ordered all public schools desegregated. What is difference between de jure and de facto segregation? De jure, formal or legal segregation. Official laws that mandate segregation. De facto, segregation that is not the product of official gov body requiring. Result of societal forces or individual choice. They will congregate together. Laws designed to eliminate de jure segregation. What did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 do? Non-discrimination in both gov and non-government public accommodations and businesses. What did the Voting Rights of 1965 do? Dealt with political rights. Ensured the rights of A to have their suffrage protected. Enabled FedGov to strike down literacy test, grandfather clause, etc. What does strict scrutiny mean as it applies to racial preferences? Acts as a means to prevent racial discrimination. What major civil rights law prohibits sex discrimination in hiring, firing, and compensation of employees? The Civil Rights Law of 1964, Title VII. What precisely does the 19th Amendment guarantee and not guarantee to women? Guarantees them the right to vote and nothing else. Doesn't guarantee them civil rights. How has the Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment as applied to gender and sexual orientation over time, and how does they compare to its treatment of race? Everyone is entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. People of any sexual orientation and gender are protected under this amendment. Gay marriage, for example. Therefore, any type of this discrimination is prohibited.